Back in 2016, I was working as a tool designer at IO Interactive on the Hitman series. And we were using the Glacier 2 engine and editor to make that, which is still one of the best engine editors I've ever worked with, and they make it in-house. Now, to design good solutions for editors, you have to literally sit behind a user and watch them work. For example, the problem I saw while sitting behind artists who are placing a lot of assets is that sometimes they found it difficult to grab the right axis on a translate gizmo to move objects. They had to rotate the camera, and then they could grab it. Now, nobody had mentioned this problem. Nobody had mentioned it to me. Nobody had written a Jira ticket. This was something that simply wasn't talked about. And no survey or questionnaire would have spotted this issue either. People are doing this kind of work subconsciously. They've gotten used to it over years and years, so they don't even think it is a problem. So it's important to observe users to find out what problems they are really dealing with. Now, why is a small issue important like that? That depends on team size and on project length. Let's assume, for example, and this is just some easy numbers to calculate this quickly. Let's assume we have 20 artists losing 2 seconds every minute. That's 16 times 2 is 120 seconds, is 2 minutes per hour. Let's say they do this work like 5 hours in a day. So it's 5 hours of work, so 2 times 5 is 10 minutes. But there's 250 working days in a year, so let's say, 10 times 250 is 2,500 minutes, which is 42 hours. So 42 hours times 20, because we have 20 artists, means 840 hours per year lost on this. Now, a project is not just 1 year, it's like 4 years. So like a 4-year project is times 840 is 3,360 hours lost on something like this. So why is a small issue important? Because small repeated actions have really big impacts. So we've spotted the problem. Now let's do some research, right? Like, what do other translate gizmos do? Have they solved this problem? Do they also need to rotate the camera or not? So I took a look through Unity, Unreal, Maya, and 3ds Max to take a look. So let's make a big table of all the features that they have for the translate gizmo and figure out, has this problem been solved already? Now first, XYZ arrows, yes, everyone does that. It's simple, sure, but it's important to check on. And 2-axis planes, yes, everyone does that too. You can click and drag on any of these 2-axis planes and move an object around. Now, the center orb or cube, where you can move something relative to where the camera is looking, Unreal, Maya, and 3ds Max have this, but Unity does not, or not by default at least. You have to hold Shift and then it appears, so it's slightly different. That may not be a bad thing, but it's important to note that there are differences there. Maya and 3ds Max have this thing where they allow the gizmo to be resized. Maybe that could help with finding gizmo easier or touching the arrows. But it's neat, it's interesting. And also Maya also allows you to resize specific parts of the gizmo. Maybe that can help. It's definitely interesting from an accessibility standpoint that you can make individual parts larger and smaller. And then there's a camera relativity in Unreal. So you can move an object without having to move the camera. Think about how many times you've moved an object, then you got to move the camera, move an object, then you got to move the camera. What if you could move the camera and the object at the same time? Maybe this could be helpful. Or what about duplicate drag? Like Unreal, Maya, and 3ds Max have this where you can simply duplicate and drag so you can quickly place a lot of objects. Another interesting one that 3ds Max has is a per object gizmo. So you can have multiple objects selected and they each show a local gizmo. And it's, you can drag objects around with that. That's neat, interesting. So at first I thought, like, who would use this? Why would this ever be useful? And so I walked around the whole offices of IO and I asked people like, hey, what do you think? What do you think? What would you use this for? And nobody would really use it until I talked to an animator. And the animator told me, oh, I could see all the local rotations of all the bones they have selected in one go. That's really useful. I'm like, oh, right. So it's a use case of not many people, but still really important for them. And then there's axis locking, which Maya has and 3ds Max sort of has, where you can move an object over a particular axis and still snap it to things. Like, for example, these vertices, I can snap it to them, but the object only moves on one particular axis. It's pretty neat. And Maya also has gestured movement. It's like shift middle mouse button, and then you kind of like click and drag. And so you don't have to touch the translate gizmo. So you don't even have to touch where the arrows are. You simply gesture in the right direction, which also means you can move objects in and out of the scene without looking at them. That could be neat. But then Unity also has flipping axis. You see those 2D planes? They're flipping as we are moving around the gizmo. So you can always easily grab the right 2D axis planes. That's interesting. So we've gone through this whole list of all these features, and it's important here to consider that to research as wide as possible. Compare other tools, other studios, and inside studios. Like really try to figure out, has a problem been solved already? Do I need to, design something from scratch, or can I grab something and mash a couple of things together and do something interesting? So now that we know what is out there, we can design a solution. So in this case, we have this gizmo, and I was thinking, we're going to flip it. We're going to flip the whole gizmo every time you look at it, just like those 2D axis planes we saw. Now, the thing is, if you just flip it as is, then X is still X and Y is still Y, and there's a problem with that, because I went around the company again and asked a lot of people, like, hey, if we flip the gizmo, is that a problem? Is that a problem? And nobody found it a problem. Everyone was like, great, sounds good. Then I talked to gameplay engineers, and they were like, no, do not do this. Because if we don't know what negative X is and negative Y, then that's really problematic for our testing purposes. We look at these gizmos a lot for like moving objects around and testing things. So we really need to know what negative and positive is. And so if you always flip the gizmo, we're not going to be able to see this. So no, we can't just flip it. That's not correct. So what about we change the arrow slightly? Or, we, add a little minus X and minus Y to it. It's sort of interesting, but also it didn't quite work. It still looks, if you glance at it, if you just like squint your eyes a little bit, it still looks exactly the same as a regular gizmo. So no, can't do that either. And then I was like, what if I just, in Photoshop, something simple, just flip the arrows? And now if you squint, the thing is, it looks too different. It looks too weird. It doesn't quite look like the kind of gizmo anymore that you would expect. And also, do you now have to like touch all the way at the arrow tip, or is it just, somewhere along the line? A little bit confusing. No, it doesn't quite work either. So what if we just make the line really large? And then, we flip the arrows all the way at the end? No, now it looks like complex, difficult. It's too much going on. No, doesn't work either. What if we, make them a little bit shorter, and then, just flip the arrows a little bit, just the arrowheads? But again, if you squint, it looks exactly like a regular gizmo. You can't really tell from a squint. It still looks the same. So in the corner of your eye, you might mistake it, which is bad, so can't have that happen. Now, what if we just do something like really weird? Like we just change the arrows completely when they're flipped. No, now it looks like a scale gizmo. No, not correct. No, can't do that either. What if we hollow out the arrows? And this was a solution I landed on. Because if you squint, it still looks slightly different. You can tell there's a slight color difference there, but it's also still clear where you can grab it and that it's a translate gizmo. So great, this worked out really, really well. So again, what was the problem that we were really dealing with? Well, users cannot grab the gizmo easily. There's a lot of arrows, and sometimes, they got to rotate the camera and then they can grab the arrow. So what was the solution? The solution was make the gizmo grabbable from any angle. So this was the actual solution in Glacier 2. So you can see that no matter how we look at the object, the arrows are always facing it. And they clearly show minus X and minus Y, and they have hollowed out arrows for the negative sections. So it's much easier to work with. Sometimes it becomes yellow a little bit because my house is moving over it as I'm orbiting around here. But generally, this works. This makes sense. Even if we go underneath it, the Z-axis also flips. So it's always easy to grab the object no matter where you're looking at it from. Now, what was the total process time of this effort? What was me, one designer, and one engineer? It's about a week of on and off work together, which is great against the potential like 3,360 hours of savings. Remember, like all those artists doing this stuff? That's a great amount of savings for really not that much time. So it's important to research the tools and research the people too. And to research the people, it's important to ask why. And for example, an actual request I have heard is the translate gizmo needs to be yellow. Now, what does that really mean? The user comes to you and kind of goes, hey, translate gizmo needs to be yellow. What does that mean? So let's ask why. So why? Well, they're having trouble using the gizmo. Well, why? Well, the gizmo is hard to see. But why? Well, there's too much stuff on top of the gizmo. Okay, but why? Well, because all the assets near the gizmo are covering it. But why? Well, because the gizmo is rendered depending on the depth relative to the camera, and as such, before some of the assets on top of it are rendered on screen. So the problem was, sure, we had a gizmo, but sometimes you had so many objects that they would cover up the gizmo. You couldn't easily see it anymore, especially if we have a bunch of see-through assets that kind of like bundle up together and the depth becomes really difficult. And yeah, people are just kind of thinking, hey, if we just make the translate gizmo bright yellow, then it becomes easy to grab. So the actual problem here, is not the translate gizmo needs to be yellow, it's the gizmo's rendered depending on the depth relative to the camera, and as such, before some of the assets on top of it are rendered on screen. So it's important to always listen to a user's issue, but never take their suggested solution for granted. You need to keep asking why until you find the actual core of the issue. So when it comes to the design of a translate gizmo, the takeaways really here are observe users to find out what problems they're dealing with, and research as wide as possible. Compare other tools, other studios, and inside studios. And always listen to a user's issue, but never take their suggested solution for granted. And keep asking why until you find the core of the issue. Sometimes a user is directly correct with the issue, but sometimes there's a bigger issue behind it, and you got to find that to make the right tool for them. Thank you very much.